Hello, everyone. I hope it's all working. We also have, we will film this event, so thank you very much for accepting this based on the GDPR rules. We will mainly focus on our guest and on the discussion, but still everybody in the room needs to agree with that. My name is Miruna Budnago-Troncota. I am associate professor here in SNSPA in Bucharest, and we are a partner in the project Jean Monnet Academic Network Linking Europe at the Periphery, LEAP. And we are already in the last part of our project, which is the most intense in academic terms, because we have this opportunity to teach in each other's universities. We have to finish our publications and to organize the last conference and the last event. So for everyone who wants to know more about our project that started back in 2019, when there was a completely different world, we invite you to check our website, leapjeanmonnet.eu, and you'll find out more about this. And I have the great pleasure today to host in SNSPA, in our partner university in LEAP, not only one of the partners in the project, but also the coordinator of LEAP, Professor Basak Alpan. She is one of the, let's say, creators of this academic network that includes partners from Georgia, Kosovo, Ukraine, and Turkey and Romania. Unfortunately, our colleagues from Ukraine, since the war started, could not join us for the events, but we will do our best to keep them also included in our project. In a way, our project was visionary for including all these parts of European neighborhood. Without further ado, first of all, I want to thank you everyone for knowing that this is a Friday evening. And knowing that it is close to our Easter holidays, but I'm definitely sure that you'll take great benefit of today's discussion. Also, because not only because of the topic, we all the time discuss in our international relations classes about Turkey's foreign policy and the recent changes, but this time we have the perspective of a renowned scholar with a strong constructivist background that will share with us some of the newest concepts about Turkish foreign policy, and these are, this is the concept of de-Europeanization. Basak has already coordinated a special issue on Turkey's policy in the Balkans and this tendency of de-Europeanization. So she will share with us some very strong academic results from our project, and she's also very open for discussion. I encourage most of you, being students in our university studying about these topics, to have courage and to enter into the discussion, because this is the chance now to share your thoughts, your questions, your ideas with our professor. Also, I'd like to thank other experts that beyond our university joined us, Mr. Matescu and Raluca from the Romanian Diplomatic Institute, Mr. Vladimir Mitev, a great expert on the Balkans and the relations of Bulgaria and Romania. Without further ado, I would like to present, to offer the floor to Basak Alpan, and I'm also ready with my first questions on her topic, and I look forward for her presentation.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm so happy to be here in Bucharest for the second time. Miruna very kindly talked about our project LEAP, Linking to Europe at the Periphery. We started in 2019, and we experienced a war, a pandemic, an earthquake, and zombie, I think, and zombies will be the next, I guess. So we were kind of unfortunate, but at the same time, it was a very good project in the sense that it brought together very different perspectives and countries together. So I'm really very happy to be a part of it, and this experience really made us different colleagues and different, it provided us with different perspectives. And I'm very much much appreciative of you coming here today. I mean, a Friday evening at 5:30, so I will try to live up for it. So thank you very much for being here. Today's presentation will be on article that we already published back, last year now, with Ahmet Erdi from London Metropolitan University. The title is Turkish Foreign Policy in the Balkans Amidst Soft Power and De-Europeanization. So it went out from the Southeast European and Black Sea Studies. So in this very article, we try to understand whether the Turkish foreign policy in the Balkans had a fundamental shift starting from 2010. So this was our general perspective. And today I will try to talk about some of the main arguments of the paper. The initial point that we started it with was basically Turkey is back in the Balkans, right? I mean, especially starting from early 2000s, it had been quite intensely dubbed that Turkey had been back in the Balkans, especially due to the incumbent parties, AKP's nuanced perspective in terms of the Balkans. So basically, this article, this research had a very fundamental question in mind. How can we make sense of this premise with regard to the notions of soft power and de-Europeanization? I mean, these are the two axes of our conceptual framework that we use in this very research. We use the term soft power because starting from early 2000s, it had been very frequently argued that Turkey is employing a soft power perspective in terms of its foreign policy. Soft power meaning that you're kind of trying to form an influence on third countries, on neighbors, in the region, not thanks to military precautions or hard security perspectives, but with ideology, with ideas, norms. You as a country are trying to form an area of influence by using some normative elements and some ideas, right? So this is one of our departure points. The second point is that it's not a now I feel like I'm singing. The second point is basically that, especially starting from 2005, it had been quite frequently argued that Turkey had diverged from the European path, right? And this, I mean, the basic academic endeavor was to understand whether this divergence could be understood as a de-Europeanization process. De-Europeanization is now a very widely used conceptual framework. Now I will try to give some information on this as well. On the grounds that especially within a world where the EU is constantly going through crises, these crises are kind of trying or creating some alternative ideas and alternative perspectives on the European project. So the fundamental question of the Europeanization is that whether the European project is still as vital and as alluring as it had been back in the 1990s, let's say, right? So basically by using those two conceptual frameworks, soft power and the Europeanization, we basically try to understand the ruptures and continuities of Turkish foreign policy, especially with a particular emphasis in the Balkans. This is the general framework. So I need to juggle with two different. Not this one. Okay. I'm embarrassed now. All right. So basically, the article's main argument was that Turkey's soft power perspective remained intact in the Balkans in the 2010s. I'm saying this because Turkey had a foreign policy, had a soft power perspective in a foreign policy in the early 2000s, but due to the developments and historical milestones that I will be mentioning in a minute, this perspective kind of changed with the onset of 2010s. Turkey had a much more securitized and securitization perspective in terms of its foreign policy. But due to Turkey's de-Europeanization perspective, or let's say claim in domestic governance, Turkey's soft power in the Balkans has taken a particular form in 2010, which was basically endowed with religious, nationalist, economic, and neo-patrimonialist elements. So in this respect, today I will particularly be talking about 2010s and how Turkey's impact and foreign policy initiatives in the Balkans have shifted or had a nuanced version in the Balkans. By the way, what I mean by the Balkans is usually because, no one is in the Balkans when you ask them. So Balkans is basically, what we meant by the Balkans is basically the Western Balkan 5 and plus Greece. These were the countries that we had a chance to conduct interviews with. We didn't have any interviewees from Romania, which doesn't mean that you are not from the Balkans. This is just... yeah, I know. Well, when I look at the breakfast, I think, anyway. So we conducted like around 80 interviews in Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, North Macedonia, Serbia, Kosovo. So that's our Balkans. You know, when you have to conduct research, you have to deal with what you have at hand, and this is our Balkans now. Right, so this is the plan of my presentation. First, I will give the general contours of Turkish foreign policy in the 2010s, by of course making references to the historical background, and I will try to explore what kind of ruptures and continuities it showed when compared to the previous eras. The second point will be referring to the Europeanization nexus, with a particular emphasis in the Balkans, because this Europeanization concept has intensely been used with regard to the Balkan perspective regarding the European project as well. Right, so the third step in the presentation will be the historical background of Turkish-Balkan relations, because I'm focusing on 2010s, but Turkey did not really reach the peninsula in 2010. So we have a particular historical background here. And finally, I will be scrutinizing the dimensions of Turkish soft power in the Balkans. So I will talk about 3 different dimensions through which we could decipher Turkey's soft power, use of its soft power in the Balkans. Right, so let's start with Turkish foreign policy in 2010s. Let's start with a more general framework. When we need to speak about Turkish foreign policy, as far as I see, you are already involved in Turkish foreign policy classes anyway, but we need to speak about 2 diverse yet interlinked processes. The first one is the EU conditionality, because Turkey had been an EU candidate with the Helsinki European Council in 1999, which means that EU conditionality is the main dynamic which kind of framed the domestic and international policies. And the second point, which might seem a bit contradictory to the EU conditionality, but still they are very closely interlinked, the securitization of Turkish foreign policy, especially starting from early 2010s, which I will be exploring in a moment. Let's start with the early 2000s, when AKP came to power in 2002, European EU integration was still the main game in town, the first place that Erdogan visited after the elections was Brussels. Rome, London, that time London was in Europe, so but yeah, so European card was still quite valid for the Justice and Development Party. But 2005 was kind of a breaking point in the sense that Turkey started the EU negotiations. And when you start the EU negotiations, I think it was the case with Romania as well, the European ideal kind of comes back to the ground, hits the ground, and you see in your daily lives that it's not so easy to do all these changes and amendments in your constitution, in your daily life, etc. In case of Turkey, there was another important development. Starting from 2005, the incumbent party, Justice and Development Party, started consolidating its power, right? So it no longer needed the European card, the EU card, as the only political, let's say, bargaining chip to be used, right? So starting from early, or let's say the second half of 2000s, Turkey started adopting a new foreign policy perspective, which was not necessarily equal to the EU conditionality. Zero problems with neighbors approach, right? The idea was that Turkey is a big country, it has the power to be a regional power, and so Europe or European project is one of the options, foreign policy options on the table, but Turkey as a big country has to deal with other options as well because of the geopolitical position of the country. So the first step in this is to have zero problems with neighbors. And when you speak about neighbors and when you speak about zero problems with neighbors, the first thing was having good relations with Syria, which will kind of open a different path, especially after the onset of civil war in Syria. So, yeah, it's working. So, in this respect, from the 2000s on, we have, or we see a region-focused activism in the Turkish foreign policy, right? So it's not only Europe which defines the foreign policy, but also relations with the Middle Eastern countries, with the Arab countries, with the North African countries that are options in the foreign policy. And as a part of this perspective, Turkey kind of labeled itself as a peace-promoting soft power. And we could, for instance, see this perspective in Turkey's attempted brokerage in the Arab Spring, which didn't work out very well. But Turkey kind of represented itself as a peace-promoting soft power, bearing the capacity for instituting order. Right, so this soft power perspective kind of showed itself in terms of cultural attraction and ideology, but at the same time in terms of, for instance, Turkey's ability or wish to attract foreign students as well, right? I mean, the visa organization or visa applications were easier for students who tried to study in Turkey, etc., etc. But all in all, what Turkey aimed was to be promoted as a soft power. And we, I think, need to think about the soft power perspective in line with this being a regional power perspective. So everything seems so rosy. Turkey is a soft power which is trying to get well with the neighbors, a candidate for being a regional power, etc., etc. Which brings us to the context of 2010s, which presents a completely different perspective, because it is the time when civil war in Syria starts. It is the time when the members of United Nations Security Council plus Germany kind of organizes or forges a deal with Iran in terms of its nuclear attempts. And plus, Turkey felt the urge to have a grasp or have a control of the mobilization of some terrorist organizations like ISIS and PKK. So in this respect, Syria had been a very exigent, a very burning point for Turkish foreign policy. Turkey had been too proactive in terms of Syria problem, Syria rift, which kind of paved the way to the migration crises or Turkish perspective in migration crises as well. So we see that Turkey's perspective, foreign policy perspective, is getting more securitized more and more, which kind of found its pinnacle with the 15th of July 2016 attempted coup. This really created a real ontological threat on the part of the Turkish state. I mean, Turkish state felt quite threatened with this coup attempt on the 15th of July 2016, which kind of forced the country to adopt a much more hard security perspective. Right? This was also intertwined with, my bank is calling from Turkey for some reason. Anyway, with this also was intertwined with Turkish extra-border operations in Syria. Turkey organized 2 extra-border operations in Syria, one in 2016, one in 2018, Euphrates Shield and Olive Branch operations. So this kind of showed that peace-seeking regional power discourse is no longer working, right? So there is a new Turkey, quote unquote, which is kind of on the ground. This also showed itself with regard to the hard security measures taken at the Syrian border as well. For instance, in May 2017, Aselsan, the state-owned factory for military equipment, was awarded the contract for supply of armored and unarmored mobile surveillance units for border control. And please, I think we need to think this in terms of the migration crisis, refugee crises, which started in 2015 as well. So the precautions taken at the border, the physical precautions, are getting harder and harder. Aselsan, that factory I'm talking about, also built a border security system at Turkey's border with Syria. It includes the so-called smart military towers with observation and obstruction systems. So this peace-seeking Turkey trying to attract students a decade ago is kind of shifting now, right? We have a different perspective in Turkish case. So, as I already said, I mean, starting from at least 1999, when Turkey had been granted the EU candidacy, the notion of Europeanization had come to characterize the Turkish foreign policy, because now Turkey is a candidate state, also Turkey is a NATO member, so the institutional links with Europe kind of was changing the way of doing things, right? But the Europeanization of foreign policy could also be listed, I mean, under this conceptual framework. For instance, Tonra, I usually like this definition by Tonra, defines the Europeanization of foreign policy as transformation in the way in which national foreign policies are constructed, in the way in which professional roles are defined and perceived, and in the consequent internalization of norms and expectations arising from a complex system of collective European policy making. So even if Turkey is not an EU member, even if most of the EU chapters are blocked, Turkey was still aligning most of its policies with the acquis communautaire, EU acquis communautaire, especially after 1999 when Turkey had become an EU candidate. This mainly meant civilization being much more civilian, having a much more civilian foreign policy, especially with regard to Turkey's frozen conflicts with Greece and Cyprus. So, especially with Greece, especially in terms of the problems in the Aegean Sea, after the Helsinki European Council, there had been bilateral talks and attempts to ameliorate things. Europeanization of Turkish foreign policy also meant aligning with the CFSP acquis, aligning with the common foreign and security policies, acquis communautaire, and of course participation in the EU-led NATO operations. In the meantime, Turkey became the 5th largest contributor to the EU force. So, especially within the course of 2000s, Turkey's foreign policy was mainly and predominantly Europeanized. Which brings us, hopefully you're not very bored, but we are only in the year 2005 now. Sorry. The post-2005 period, as I've already said before, basically signals the downturn in Turkey-EU relations and a growing disenchantment on both sides. On Turkish side, I've already said the AKP, Justice and Development Party, no longer needed the European card as much as it needed before. And in all negotiating countries, there is kind of a falling down of the EU support in the public opinion. And on the EU side as well, it was right after the Big Bang enlargement of 2004 and the Southeast enlargement in 2007. So the EU found it very hard to find new reasons to get new candidates and countries in. Right, so in this respect, Turkey's reform fatigue, that the EU reforms were losing their velocity, was intertwined with the so-called enlargement fatigue on the part of the EU. Right, the EU found it very hard, or tell it to the electorate that it's a good idea to get new members. This is the time period where we very frequently heard the term de-Europeanization. Turning away from the European ideals, not only in terms of candidates, but in terms of member states as well. I'm sure you already heard about the term, but I think we really need to think about this term in terms of the EU's recent crises. So it's not only the Europeanization is not only about the candidate countries, neighboring countries, but it is also about the member states, as it is the case, for instance, with Poland and Hungary nowadays. So against the background of the recent crises of the European Union, such as migration crisis, Brexit crisis, COVID-19 very recently, the limited impact and effectiveness of EU enlargement, and of course, last but not least, the rising tide of populism, right? It's always a good idea to blame the EU for things that are not going well at the domestic level. So in this respect, the Europeanization had been used as an explanant, something which explains this deterioration. Okay, you see it's because of Europe that we have so many refugees. It's because of Europe that so many people died because of COVID, right? It's always a good idea to find a scapegoat. So basically, the Europeanization means that it is now worse than it was, right? So, I mean, this is exactly something which feeds the populist policies as well, a very twisted, nostalgic perspective that everything is going bad, the EU is stealing our jobs, so on and so forth. So, I mean, you could always fill the blanks like this. So basically, the Europeanization is usually defined as the loss or weakening of the EU as a normative political context and as a reference point in domestic settings and national public debates, right? So this might be because of the domestic factors, because of the developments at the EU, or maybe because of the regional and international developments, right? It might be because of global developments, but perhaps the scapegoat is the EU. So this is the general gist of this de-Europeanization context. But in this respect, I mean, I always argue that we need to differentiate between EUization and Europeanization, right? Because EUization is basically a more formal and overwhelmingly technical process of adjustment, the most radical impacts of which are manifested during the accession negotiations. So EUization is basically something that a candidate country is approximating the EU perspective, whereas Europeanization is something much more larger and much more extensive. A context from which the varying ideas, norms, and values can be extracted and used at the subnational, national, and supranational politics. So, in this respect, when we speak about Europeanization, we shouldn't only be talking about institutionalist framework. Okay, there might be good institutions that you mimic, that you adopt with regard to the EU level, but at the same time, the European perspective has to be reliant, has to be there for you to let's say, formulate and determine your internal debates. In the Turkish case, this turning away from the EU anchor had been intertwined with Turkey's descent into authoritarianism and AKP populism. Populism had already been something that had been resorted by almost all leaders anywhere, and Erdogan was no exception in this respect. And, especially after the Gezi Park protests of 2013 and intertwined with the 15th of July coup attempt in 2016, there had been an authoritarian twist in Turkish politics in terms of the amendment, legal amendments, in terms of in terms of some of the political leaders and intellectuals getting into prison. And we also have to think that this time the demon for AKP was the Gülen movement, right? I mean, as I will be giving the details in terms of the Balkans, this rift between the AKP and Gülen movement kind of emerged in 2015-16, especially after the coup. So the reflection of this Europeanization on the Turkish foreign policy had been, as I've already been saying, too much engagement with Syria, right? Because Turkey felt itself unsecure in terms of a potential threat coming from a neighboring country. That's the reason why so many extra border operations had been organized. Which also leads us to the question of migration crisis, right? Migration crisis became a migration crisis for the EU in 2015, but it had been there already, right? It started becoming a problem back in 2011, but the EU started calling it a migration crisis back in 2015. And because Turkey kind of adopted this EU-Turkey deal, it's kind of, this migration crisis kind of hijacked the EU conditionality perspective. The EU started taking Turkey as a country to have transactional relations in case of migration, energy, foreign policy, but not a fully fledged candidate state, even if on paper Turkey is still a candidate country. So this transactionalism, this perspective on topical engagement, let's say, kind of hijacked the EU perspective in foreign policy as well. This also is intertwined with the developments in the East Mediterranean when there had been a dispute in terms of the drilling zones of Turkey and Cyprus. So in this respect, this de-Europeanization had been reflected in Turkish foreign policy in different, at different levels, let's put it this way, in terms of migration, energy, and all in all, it led to a highly securitized perspective in foreign policy. Now, perhaps it's time for the Balkans a bit, right? Where is the Balkans in this picture? Well, Balkans have always been in this picture, you know, because Turkey did not, as I've said, arrive in the Balkans in 2010. I mean, Balkans was a part of the Ottoman Empire, a very indispensable part of the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire actually had been disintegrated after the loss of the Balkans. So it was quite an important region for the empire. Plus, even if the Turkish Republic has always argued that it is completely different than the Ottoman Empire. I mean, there has been a rupture between the empire and the Turkish Republic. The first circle of administrators in Turkish Republic were always from the Balkans. This was mainly about the historical ties and historical importance of the region. After the foundation of the Turkish Republic, the rapid and relatively permanent rectification of problems of the past, because that's how the Turkish Republic said, I will no longer be dealing with the problems of the Ottoman Empire. This is a nation state, not an empire. So the idea was breaking from the empire. Yes. Well, we are celebrating on the 29th of October. Yeah. I was thinking about the Balkans, about you. About you. Turkish Republic, exactly. So after the establishment of Turkish Republic, Turkey aimed to take the Balkan countries as unitary actors, foreign policy actors, from a very realist perspective, because Turkish Republic was a very young republic and tried to forge relations with the countries, including the Balkan countries as well. Because especially in the first years of the republic, Turkey defined itself as a medium power, and so to maintain good relations with both Western and Eastern powers, including the Balkan countries as well. But especially after the Balkan Wars, which continued, the migration waves continued in the first years of the Republic as well. So, I mean, the relations with the Balkans never ended. It never ended, I mean, because the main Balkan migration wave to Turkey was after the Balkan Wars, but there has been another wave, especially from Yugoslavia, during the 1950s and 60s. Right, so there has always been some cultural contacts with the Balkans, but the pinnacle of these links came with the Özal's era, when Özal came to power, Turgut Özal came to power after 1980s, because Özal had a particular interest in the Balkans, which kind of sowed the seeds of the AKP rule later on. But when the AKP Justice and Development Party came to power in 2002, because of Erdogan's specific links in the region, I mean, there had always been a particular interest in the Balkans. For instance, this quotation is from one of the interviewees we interviewed. because Erdogan was the mayor of Istanbul before coming to power. So this is actually a quotation from a Serbian leader, Serbian political actor. We knew Erdogan before the 2000s, and I can say that even when he was a mayor of Istanbul, he was dealing with the issues of the Balkans. Right, so it didn't start right after AKP came to power. It was already been there, and these links had been mainly carried out through the institutions such as Diyanet, Turkish Development Agency, and Yunus Emre Institute. So these institutes were kind of the carriers of this special links. When we come to 2010s, especially after Ahmet Davutoğlu becomes the foreign minister of Turkey, we could see the Davutoğlu impact in terms of Turkey's relations with the Balkan countries. For Turkish public, relations with the Balkan countries was something very admirable because everyone had someone in their families coming from the Balkans, so food are the same, history is the same, so this hadn't been a problem for the Turks. But this had been a problem for the people in the Balkans because it was seen as the replica of the Ottoman times, colonialist perspective. So I think this was the general picture when Davutoğlu became the foreign minister in 2009. For instance, this quotation is from a former government minister in Albania. In the past, there was a more democratic Turkey, one that had close relations with Europe, but the chemistry has changed now. There is a more oppressive Turkey that lacks good relations with the West. Turkey is certainly a part of us. We still have many economic, cultural, and political ties, but we would like to see not this Turkey, but the other. Turkey is an active partner in our region. There are certainly many actors in the Balkans who like and want this new Turkey. So basically, this was the main takeaway message from the interviews. A Western-oriented Turkey is much more alluring and attractive for the Balkan countries. Unlike the Turkish perspective, who is trying to form a new, twisted or an alternative area of influence in the Balkans. But I think there is this kind of a rift between there. So, as I've said, the main argument of the article of the research is basically that Turkish soft power perspective is still lingering in the Balkans, and we kind of put these soft power under three different headings, or we kind of refer to three different dimensions. The first one is normative soft power, which has to do with the use of religion synthesized with nationalism. I think, use of religion in AKP's discourses or by the institutions in the Balkans is already evident, but this was intertwined with a nationalist tone as well. For instance, before the elections, Erdogan organized rallies in Bosnia, for instance, in Sarajevo. So this use of religion with nationalist, let's say, references was the first dimension of normative soft power. This is also a quotation. After 2004, the two movements, AKP and Gülen movement, accused one another of not being Muslim enough, of fraud, especially after 2016. This eventually carried the political struggle to the mosques and the religious organizations. So the reason why the discourses had a religious tone was also because of the domestic political and power struggles as well. The second dimension of soft power was basically Turkey's economic investments in the region. The economic relations Turkey crafted in the Balkans, especially after 2002, can be divided into two separate policies. One that was maintained directly through state apparatus, and another that was maintained through commercial operations with business leaders close to the state. I mean, those business owners like Cengiz Construction, Albayrak Holding. I mean, I could see some of the constructions here in Bucharest as well. So this was also a part of this material perspective, material dimension of soft power as well. And finally, personalized soft power. Erdogan's personal links with the Balkan leaders. Turkey increasingly started to be defined as a neo-patrimonial country. The term used here is neo-patrimonialism because personal links are important here. Placing Erdogan at the center and concurrently his family and inner circle growing stronger in proximity to him, right? So what really determined the relations is not institutions, let's say, but it is the personal links between families. Right? So this was kind of the perspective. For instance, on May 2018, when Erdogan and the Office of President in Turkey were unable to receive permission to hold political rallies in European capitals, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Bekir Izetbegovic hosted Erdogan. So Erdogan was not able to organize any rallies in European capitals, was able to organize one in Sarajevo. And Izetbegovic referenced Erdogan claiming that God had sent him to the Muslims. So I'm not sure if all the Bosniaks are thinking the same way, but this was the perspective. Personal links were kind of initiated and continued. So these three dimensions show that the soft power perspective from Turkish foreign policy is still lingering. I mean, the way in which they dress is almost the same. I mean, look at Vučić. I mean, they are so similarly dressed. I think this is quite interesting as well. Orban as well. I mean, very similar for some reason. I don't know. But these personal links, not only in terms of the politicians, but family links as well. This kind of is also interlinked with the populist language they use as well. So this kind of link, this kind of creates an inner circle in a way. So this is also one dimension of the soft power perspective. Conclusion. So our initial claim was that Turkish foreign policy had deviated in the 2010s from a soft power perspective, intertwined with the de-Europeanization debates. It crystallized in a particular way in the Balkans. So even if Turkish foreign policy was devoid of a soft power perspective in 2010s elsewhere, in the Balkans, it still continued and it still kind of showed itself in different dimensions. The de-Europeanization trend in Turkish politics as well as in the Turkish foreign policy led to a soft power approach in the Balkans endowed with highly nationalist, religious, economic and neo-patrimonialist elements. So this was the version, this was the new version that it took. And the main takeaway message of the interviews in the region proved to be that this trend of de-Europeanization on the part of Turkey would run the risk of detaching the country from the Balkans as well. So it's like, I mean, two processes are concomitant. So in this respect, we need to remember Putnam's two-level game. I mean, the developments that Turkey initiates due to the developments in its domestic policy is actually reflected in its foreign policy as well. So this is the general framework of the research, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A session, and thanks very much for your patience.